For the longest time, I did not think much about Gordie Howe. I obviously knew he was a hockey player. I knew he was ambidextrous, a very rare feat amongst hockey players that is basically unheard of in the current year, and I also knew that he played for a long time. Like a really, 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 really long time. Long enough, in fact, for him to play professional hockey with his own children. Notice how none of the things I've mentioned have anything to do with how good Gordie Howe was at hockey. I've observed that among younger demographics, debates about the greatest all-time hockey players predominantly involve 5 names: Connor McDavid, Wayne Gretzky, Mario Lemieux, Sidney Crosby, and Bobby Orr. One name that I do not hear much is Gordie Howe. For those of you unfamiliar with who Gordie Howe was, I will give a very brief description. Gordie Howe was a Canadian professional hockey player born in 1928. Howe was clearly highly regarded from a very young age, catching the attention of NHL scouts while he was playing with the King George Athletic Club in his hometown of Saskatoon. Howe was originally offered a contract with the New York Rangers, but rejected it because he wanted to continue to play in his hometown with his buddies. A few years later, the Detroit Red Wings offered him a contract, and he started his professional career with the Omaha Knights of the United States Hockey League. In his first and only year with Omaha, he was one of the most productive players on the entire team despite being much younger than the majority of the team. In 1946, Howe made his NHL debut with the Detroit Red Wings, and he played with the Red Wings until 1971. After his tenure with the Red Wings ended, he continued to play professional hockey, but outside of the NHL. In 1979, Howe returned to the NHL at the age of 51 to play one final season with the Hartford Whalers. As if that wasn't ridiculous enough, a 69-year-old Gordie Howe technically returned to professional hockey in 1997. 50 years after his NHL debut and 8 years after the release of unrelated Belgian techno anthem, Pump Up the Jam. He signed a one-game contract and played one shift with the Detroit Vipers of the International Hockey League, meaning that Howe had officially played professional hockey in 6 different decades. Howe then spent the next 15 or so years in retirement, until his death in 2016. Anyways, in 2026, a decade after his death, it does feel like he's been somewhat forgotten, and I do understand this in a few different ways. His HockeyDB page doesn't have any obviously jaw-dropping numbers, no living reporter, except for David Staples, got to see him at his peak, Jay Freshcards didn't exist in the 1950s, and all of the existing YouTube footage of Gordie Howe playing is retina burning. For a long time, I thought he was a 2nd or 3rd tier Hall of Famer, kinda like a Joe Sakic or something, who just got by based on longevity. But then I took a deeper look at some of his best seasons, and I realized that he was far better than I gave him credit for. Today, we're going to show Gordie Howe some love, by looking at some of the most dominant seasons in NHL history and proving that Howe's peak can compete with anybody's. Let's get started by describing what exactly we're going to do. You can find the scoring leaders from every NHL season on Hockey Reference, all the way back to the inaugural 1917-1918 season. One of the things that you might notice is that the point total for the leading scorer differs dramatically. There are years where the leading scorer has had 32 points, and years where the leading scorer has had over 200 points. There's a lot of variation across the history of the NHL. Even when you adjust for points per game, there are still clearly some eras where scoring was more prominent. This area I have highlighted here corresponds to Gordie Howe's peak, his mid to late 20s, and this happened in the early 1950s. The early 50s were not known for being an era of high offense, and it would be unfair to compare Howe's raw stats to those who played in higher scoring eras like the 1980s or 2020s. But what we can do is look at Howe's performance relative to his peers and compare it to some of the other dominant seasons in NHL history. Let's start with some basic statistics. Gordie Howe led the NHL in points a total of 6 times. This puts him in 2nd place, tied with Mario Lemieux and only behind Wayne Gretzky. It is worth noting that as of the day this is being recorded, Connor McDavid has led the NHL in scoring 5 times, and he will likely surpass Howe and Lemieux before he retires. Anyways, back to Gordie. Howe won the Art Ross, the trophy to the NHL points leader, in 1951, 1952, 1953, 1954, 1957, and 1963. But, even in years where Gordie Howe did not win the Art Ross, he was always close. Gordie Howe finished in the top 5 of NHL scoring for a total of 20 seasons, from 1950 all the way up to 1969, when he was over 40 years old. This is easily an NHL record. Wayne Gretzky was second, finishing in the top 5 of scoring 16 times, and nobody else in league history even has 10 appearances in the top 5. But the Art Ross trophies alone aren't what made Howe's career so incredible. It's that he was destroying the competition en route to them. The defining season of Gordie Howe's career was likely the 1952-1953 season. Howe scored 49 goals and 46 assists for a total of 95 points in 70 games, easily the most in the entire league. The second highest scorer had 71 points in 70 games, so Howe had 24 more points than the next highest scorer. But this feat is even more impressive when we calculate how many times as many points Howe had. If we take 95 divided by 71, that's going to give us how many times as many points Howe had than the next highest scorer. This number equals approximately 1.338. We're going to refer to this stat as our ratio of the highest point total to the second highest point total. And if we look at every single ratio in NHL history, Howe's 1953 ratio is the 8th best all time, only behind Bill Cowley's 1941 season and Gretzky's absurd dominance in the 1980s. The ratios from Howe scoring titles in 1951 and 1952 were also quite impressive, only a few spots behind his 1953 season. However, I left out one really important detail from the 1953 season. We know that Howe led the league with 95 points and that the next highest point total was 71. But what I didn't mention was that the next highest point total belonged to Ted Lindsay, his line mate. Lindsay very likely wouldn't have come close to 71 points without a line mate of Gordie Howe's caliber, so in order to truly quantify Howe's dominance, we are instead going to look at the next highest point total in the NHL among non-teammates. In 1953, the highest scoring non-Red Wing in the NHL was Maurice Richard with the Montreal Canadiens, obtaining a total of 61 points in 70 games. This means that Howe had 34 more points than the next highest non-teammate in the league, and that he had approximately 1.55 times as many points as the next highest non-teammate. If we go across every NHL season ever and look at the ratio of points from the leading scorer to the next highest non-teammate scorer, Howe's 1953 season looks even more incredible, ranking 7th in NHL history. The only seasons that rank better by this metric are once again Wayne Gretzky in the 80s and Phil Esposito in 1971 and 1974. I'm going to put a tiny little asterisk next to those two Esposito seasons. Obviously they were impressive, but in those two seasons, the top 4 scorers were all on the same team, the Boston Bruins, and it's pretty clear that these players were all beneficial to each other's point totals, especially Bobby Orr. If we just look at goals instead of points, Howe's accomplishments are equally impressive. Howe was the NHL goals leader a total of 5 times across his career. The only players who have led the league in goals more are Phil Esposito, Bobby Hull, and Alexander Ovechkin. He finished in the top 5 in goal scoring 14 times in his career, only trailing Alexander Ovechkin. And if we go back to look at Howe's peak in the early 1950s, his goal scoring was also clearly above the rest of the competition. In 1952, Gordie Howe scored 47 goals, and the next highest scorer had 31, giving him approximately 1.52 times as many goals as the next highest scorer, Bill Mosienko of the Chicago Blackhawks. Howe's 1953 season was even better, scoring 49 goals, which was 17 more than the next highest goal scorer, his line mate Ted Lindsay. The next highest scoring player who wasn't on the Red Wings was Wally Hergesheimer of the New York Rangers with 30 goals. So, in 1953, Howe had about 1.53 times as many goals as the next highest scorer, and 1.63 times as many goals as the next highest non-teammate. If we look at the ratio of highest goal scorer to the next highest goal scorer, Howe's 1952 and 1953 seasons are among the best ever, only trailing Wayne Gretzky, Brett Hull, Bobby Hull, and Maurice Richard, the man so good at scoring goals that they named a trophy after him. If we look at the same stat, except excluding line mates, Howe's 1953 season looks even better, only trailing the Hull boys and 2 of Phil Esposito's best seasons. So yeah, Howe's regular season numbers were pretty special, but how about his playoff resume? Howe only won 4 Stanley Cups, which doesn't seem that crazy considering he played his best years of hockey when there were only 5 other teams in the league to compete with. Howe had the misfortune of playing at the same time as the 1950s Montreal Canadiens, a team that had a stretch of winning 6 Stanley Cups in 8 years. In fact, from 1952 to 1960, Across 9 seasons, there was only one team that ever beat the Canadiens in the playoffs. That team was Gordie Howe's Detroit Red Wings, who defeated Montreal in the Stanley Cup Finals in 1952, 1954, and 1955. Howe's numbers were good in all of these years, but his 1955 playoff run was likely the best stretch of games of his entire career. Howe scored 9 goals and 11 assists in 11 games, making history by being the first player to ever score 20 points in a playoff run. This feat is even more remarkable when you realize that most of these playoff games were played against an absolutely stacked Montreal Canadiens roster. So, with 20 points in 11 games, his point per game pace was at approximately 1.82. To make sure you realize how utterly insane that is, note that the leading point scorer in the 1955 regular season was scoring at a rate of 1.07 points per game. And Howe's 1955 playoff run compares favorably to any player's playoff run in NHL history, including those who played in higher scoring eras. Among playoff runs of more than 10 games, Howe's 1.82 point per game pace ranks 20th of all time. That may not seem that spectacular, but I do have to mention once again that Howe did this in a lower scoring era. Furthermore, in the 1970s and the 1980s, the playoff structure was changed so that more teams would qualify for the playoffs, which led to lower quality competition and more opportunity for stars to make their stats look better. While it may not be possible to quantify the non-scoring aspects of Gordie Howe's game, I do feel inclined to mention that he was considered to be an outstanding player in terms of leadership, physicality, and being defensively responsible. He was also a big boy, measuring at 6 feet tall and 205 pounds, well above the average player weight during the 1950s. He is probably the guy most responsible for the two-way, hard-working, gritty, good Canadian kid hockey player stereotype. It's pretty cool that his playstyle was influential enough to create a stereotype, even if that stereotype led to decades of a senile man spewing xenophobic garbage on national television. I think that I've made my case clear here today. The next time you're on a date and the topic of all-time greatest hockey players comes up, please throw Gordie Howe's name into the hat. Thank you for watching. It is really fun to make these sorts of videos. I want to continue making videos linking math and professional sports, and if you have any ideas of what I can do, it doesn't matter what sport, I am very open to suggestions. Take care.